Hello, and this talk is called Across the Divide, and I'd like you not to think of us being divided from you. I want to imagine us in the room together as we would be in other circumstances. And we would be with you, speaking to you and with you, but we'd also be with each other. And the exceptional nature of what we're about to say is that we are both together. We come from different sides of the Holocaust, and we are preaching the same message. So I'll start by handing over to my wonderful co-speaker, Noemie, and she will tell you a bit about her side of the story. Over to you, Noemie.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to speak to you, my dear audience. I may call you my dear friends. I can't see you, but I've tried to imagine you and your eyes on us, and trying to reflect our thoughts, Derek's and mine, to you, over to you. The talk is called Speaking Across the Divide, but it's actually coming together and being together and speaking as two human beings to a whole load of other human beings. And I'm sure if you look at each other, that you will see similarities and differences. And I would like to propose to you that we can celebrate differences. We don't necessarily like differences when we are young, and we might be alarmed, even frightened by different cultures. But yet we know, you and I, who've been, for example, to different restaurants, part of my culture I love to eat, to know that we enjoy that. And we go again and we learn from that and we grow from that and we get stimulated by that. I know that we're capable of all sorts. We're human. We belong to one race, and that's the human race. We're capable of good and evil. We're all capable as ordinary people of heroics. No hero was born as a hero. No evil man was born as evil. So where do I come from, and why do I think that kindness and basic humanitarian characteristics are so important in today's world, where some people are pulling at all sorts of extreme poles? I come to you as a daughter of two survivor parents. My mum, Renee, was a little girl, aged 10, when her parents made the agonizing decision to send her and her older sister Helen, aged 13, and her younger brother Joey, aged 9, away from the parental home in the southwest of France, Saint-Junien, to Switzerland to be safe. That was in May 1944. By then, the town was invaded by Germans, and Germans came with increasing frequency, picking children, literally picking children off the streets. Entire families disappeared overnight. From 42 to 44, Mum frequently went into hiding, in barns, in farms, in convents. She says she cried, bidding her parents goodbye, going to the unknown, but she didn't know what the unknown would be. Initially, they made their way into the neighboring town of Limoges, and there they were looked after by nuns in a convent. They stayed roughly for 2 weeks. Mum, little Renee, describes the nuns as being very kind. However, they did ask each child individually. My mum was together with her siblings, as I said, and also 2 other children that they didn't know joined this little group initially. And the nuns asked them to be baptized, saying that not if you die, but when you die, you will go to hell as a Jew. But if you are baptized, you will go to heaven. Mum, even though she was only young, little Renee, held on to her beliefs and refused to be baptized. The other instructions, such as weeding, it was asparagus season, she did follow conscientiously and helped the nuns. There was a girl who had lost her mind, so in Mum, little Renee's words, she was 15 because she'd seen her parents murdered. Now Renee was 10. I keep on saying that because it's important that we hang on to that image of this little girl with her curly hair and blue eyes, and of course hadn't heard about death or dying. Even today, for me, death is still very much an abstract and apologies. So it's a very difficult concept. However, Renee, like I said, carried on with the values that she was imbued with from home. And the journey continued to Lyon, the big station in Lyon, the Gare du Perrache, where it was being bombed and they had to hide in cellars and caves. Again, a new group leader. Again, more children joined. Now, you and I, if we were that age, would feel safe if we saw police on the street, if we saw other adults on the street with a kind face whom we could ask. For Renee, who was a French citizen, but born to the Jewish faith, she could no longer rely on the people that normally provided safety for citizens. Police were no longer people of safety. They were people to fear. On the train that they took then from Lyon to carry on to reach Switzerland, there were many people in uniform. Renee was frightened. Do you know what Renee did? She went to hide in the toilets. She couldn't face sitting in the carriage. They arrived in Annecy. It's a beautiful French alpine town, very picturesque, with a river flowing, with a lake, with the Alps visible across the lake. And the children felt that they were close to Switzerland. They were met by a wonderful young group leader called Marianne Kohn. Marianne, little Renee describes, was very special. She was warm. She provided them reassurance, made them feel safe, and gave them hope. Marianne took them in a car which was covered almost like some of you who have seen pictures from that era, with a sort of green canvas. It was hot by then. It was end of May, June, and the children were cramped into that van. By then, they were a group of 32 children aging from 2 to 18. They had missed the train. Renee wasn't informed as to why. On the way from Annecy to the border town, to Annemasse, the van suddenly stopped, screeched to a halt. There was a car in front of the van and a car behind, 4 SS officers in front and a whole bunch of SS officers behind, with barking dogs, who demanded to know what was going on. Marianne stepped out and said that these were the children of railway workers, and she was bringing them to a holiday camp in Viry, which is very close to the border of Switzerland, so that the children could have respite and safety. The SS said to Marianne, "We'll accompany you to this children's home and check that all is okay." And they did. And the lady that met the group of children, they were forced to step out then of the van, together with Marianne, said she wasn't expecting this mixed group of boys and girls. She was only expecting boys. Renee was then interrogated. What's your name? What's your parents' name? Where do your parents live? Are you Jewish? This went on into the middle of the night. The older children were taken immediately to Annemasse prison. Renee was taken in the early hours of the morning to Annemasse following the questioning and some rest. In Annemasse, she was interrogated daily. A gun held to her face by Gestapo Meyer, which Renee describes having unnaturally piercing blue eyes, staring her in the eyes, asking, "Are you Jewish? What's your parents' name? Where are you from?" At one point, he got angry, and he said, looking at Renee's older sister, Helen, "Geh raus!" And what did that mean? Get out. Now, Helen, Renee and Joey understood that because they came originally from Strasbourg and they spoke German there, a dialect sort of German. but none of them moved. Renee says she was rooted to the ground with fear, and Helen may be a mixture of both bravery and fear. And this went on whilst the children were in prison for a few weeks. Their group leader, they saw towards, after a few days, when she returned from labour at the end of the day, totally deformed. Her head, Renee goes, was 3 times the size of her actual head, the face swollen, red, and totally disfigured. She had been given hot and cold bath, amongst other things. When that had happened to Marianne, she told her children, "Children, say the truth." Incidentally, it's not so incidental. It's huge. Marianne was offered escape, freedom and safety by the French underground resistance to which she belonged, who organised this whole trip for the children. Marianne refused to leave her charges. Marianne was taken in June 44, raped, tortured and murdered in a ditch in a forest nearby. Renee and her siblings and the remaining group of children were saved by the Lord Mayor of Annemasse, Jean Defoe. He made a pact with the Gestapo saying that he'll facilitate their escape to Switzerland if the Gestapo leaves the children to him. The children were going to be shot, you see, because the railway lines across France were already not functioning because in part they had been bombed. So they couldn't get the kids easily to Auschwitz or Drancy or to other extermination camps. Shooting was the easiest resource. The Gestapo agreed, and I saw a paper most recently where the Lord Mayor had to sign that if they do wish to return the Gestapo, he must return the children to them. They were also told, the children and the Lord Mayor, that if they tried to escape, they would all be shot. When the Gestapo left, the Lord Mayor took them away from Annemasse to a place nearby called Bonne-sur-Ménage, and from there he managed their safety to Switzerland, to Geneva. My dad, very briefly, you see the poster in the background, was 17 in 1939. He went into frequent hiding and went into a trial labour camp and had already by then seen his fellow Polish citizens of Jewish faith being trampled on, beards pulled out, just at their whim, basically. On the night that he decided not to go into hiding, he was discovered by the Gestapo, forced out of his parents' flat by being beaten by clubs and taken to his first labour camp at the age of 19 called Grünheide. He was in 7 labour and concentration camps over 4.5 years and was liberated on the 30th of April 1945 near Munich by the Americans. My dad subsequently studied medicine and dentistry, always looking after mankind professionally and also in the community, and taught us to love people. I grew up with a love of Munich, no idea of its background, especially in that, well, I'm speaking to you, it'll be the new year, but Christmas time, it was magical in Munich. We adopted a Catholic lady as our grandma. We adored her, who taught me to love and enjoy Advent. And it was, my parents didn't tell us about their past. I, together with Derek, feel passionate that we do need to educate people and empower you all to look at your own inner conscience and beware of joining a crowd conscience. I will end by reading a passage of The Long Night. Thank you. We marched on hard-packed snow. The peace and quiet of Sunday lay gently over the little town as we marched through. Our march became more and more arduous because we had to go up an incline. We were wretched, despairing figures as we struggled to drag ourselves along the white-covered streets. Suddenly, a loud noise of church bells rang in our ears. Before us lay the church proclaiming Sunday. Although we retained only a pitiful glimmer of life and hope, the chimes of the bells touched something barely alive in each of us. Did this signify anything? Had the priest rung the bells on this peaceful Sunday morning to call together the good citizens of this small town to protest against inhumanity and indignity in general, and this awful procession of corpses in particular. We really wanted to believe, to hope that the world was at last alerted from its indifference and had eyes to see this dreadful drama as it passed before them, the martyrdom, the torture, and death of helpless people. Could they not see, hear, and feel that in the face of this unfathomable mass murder, they could not and should not any longer remain silent? Just then the gates of the church opened, and a crowded mass of people burst out. The service must have just finished. The faithful slipped off the pavement into the road, the same street where we had encountered the churchgoers. The SS quickly tried to force us onto the left side of the street, with a few blows from their batons. They passed by very close to us, this God-fearing community in their best Sunday dress, men, women and children, all pious, clutching their prayer books in gloved hands. They lowered their eyes and looked away as they passed by. Was it fear or indignation? Dread or contempt? We could only believe it was their contempt. That was all we had become accustomed to for so long. And the bells rang louder and louder, really near, really loud. They seemed to ring directly from the hearts of the pious, the children of God, who only seemed to know about love your neighbor and compassion from the pages of the Bible. They calmly surveyed our misery, and with hardened hearts observed us like statisticians contemplating criminals. Thank you.
Thank you, Noemie. And from somebody whose family suffered in the Holocaust to somebody whose family inflicted suffering in the Holocaust. And I'll start my story not in Germany, but in Lanarkshire, Scotland in the 1960s. I'll share my screen now and give you a wee presentation of photographs that 10 years ago I'd never seen. And here we are in Lanarkshire. The wee fella in his chair is me. My brother's behind me. And then behind him, with his hands on his shoulders, is my dad. My dad wasn't like other dads. Lanarkshire was a very close-knit county of Scotland. My dad was an economic migrant. But that wasn't the main problem. The main problem rests with the garden gate behind him. My dad came to Scotland from Germany. His sister had married a Scottish soldier, and my dad joined her years later and eventually met my mum. And one summer, my dad's brother and his family came over from Germany to visit. My dad's brother brought us gifts, the most amazing thing ever produced in Germany. And I hold them up now, you can see lederhosen. My brother and I wore these in the garden. We were sliding around, catching them in sharp objects, and yet they stayed intact. These were indestructible pants. Vorsprung durch Technik. But here's the thing. I only found out from my mum just a few years ago, after my dad had died, that she wouldn't let us walk outside that garden gate. And the reason was, if we were wearing our lederhosen and we stepped out, people would realise that we had a connection with Germany. It wasn't that long since the war had ended. But if the local people had known exactly what my dad's father had done, he would have got an even worse reaction. Just a few years ago, I discovered the true story of my grandfather, a perpetrator of the Holocaust, and got access to something like 500 photographs that told his story. And so this, very briefly, is his story, not the story of an inherently evil man. As Noemie said, nobody is born evil. This was somebody who fell into evil ways. And it started so innocuously. This is my grandparents just after they're married. They're showing tenderness towards each other. There's something else. This little object here shows that my grandfather served in the First World War. He was involved in the worst possible battles, the Somme, Ypres. He was wounded and taken prisoner, and then captured and taken in France. He was kept until after the Versailles Treaty was signed in 1920. He returned to Germany, a broken country, and like many around him, looked for people to blame. And many of them blamed the Jews. But for quite some years, there was no political activism on my grandfather's part whatsoever. He raised his first two children in happy surroundings. He'd been born in the Pied Piper town of Hameln, but by the time this photograph was taken in 1928, he was now working in Dortmund. And these are his first two children, my Aunt Anna, who would later go to Scotland, and then little Dieter. This is a Christmas scene, it's ethereal. My grandfather is very good at taking photographs. He took photographs of his children as any father would. And because he was an old soldier, he took photographs of the army. There are no swastikas here. This is before Hitler comes to power. We're in Dortmund in the main square. But at some point, my grandfather joined the SS. He joined in 1930, we don't know why, and the SS, or rather, sorry, the Nazi Party, was not in favour in Dortmund. This was a communist city. Most people voted communist. And this is a photograph, one of two that my grandfather took, of a stormtrooper parade through a communist district of Dortmund. My grandfather, for whatever reason, is now a committed member of the Nazi Party. To such an extent that he became a party official. Here he is doing a good impression of Oliver Hardy. My grandmother, Mina, is pregnant. We know, therefore, that this is the summer of 1933. Hitler has come to power. And on these evenings after work, my grandfather has to knock on people's doors and ask them about their political affiliations. And if they don't accord with that of Adolf Hitler, he's supposed to report them to the Gestapo. We move on now to 1935. And there are happy children here. My dad is now born wearing a very natty hat. They look happy, but there are sinister undertones. Little Dieter is wearing the badge of the Hitler Youth. Anna is wearing a coat of the girls' version of the Hitler Youth. And the man, my grandfather, taking this picture, is now in some difficulty. He's lost his job. He has a wife and 3 children to support. And he says to his landlord, I can't pay my rent. He has a friend who says, I know somebody who could pull strings for you. He went to the same school as you in Hameln. He's also Heinrich Himmler's deputy in the SS. And so my grandfather went down to Bavaria to join the SS, to become indoctrinated. And this is one of numerous photographs he took of his SS colleagues. Not just colleagues, but they called each other friends. My grandfather mixed with at least 10 men who went on to become concentration camp commandants, drinking with them, socializing with them. He took this photograph, the most historically significant in the whole collection. You can see here there's a group of SS gathered. This man on the left is giving the Hitler salute to a very important man there. My grandfather is perhaps so excited or so nervous that the camera is shaking in his hands. He's taking this photograph on the exact location of the visitor center at Dachau concentration camp. Initially, my grandfather was working as an auditor for the SS next door. Initially. And we jump forward again now. My grandfather has been relocated to Berlin. His family are given a wonderful, beautiful home. We now have a fourth sibling, my uncle Ecki, the one who's still alive today. They moved into a fantastic estate on the edge of Berlin, next to the Grunewald, the forest. That's the children. Here are the adults. My wife and I call this the Nazi Party, because this estate was built for officers of the SS. And they're having a housewarming party on New Year's Eve, 1939. My grandparents there and there are totally drunk. And there is this sense throughout all these hundreds of photographs of a family living comfortably at a time when other things were happening. At about the time that this photograph was taken, Noemie's father was taken away by the Nazis. The war was underway. Thousands of people in Berlin were being killed by bombs, but in this little SS enclave, protected from everything, the family were doing what families would do otherwise. My aunt here having a wardrobe malfunction. My dad hitching up his shorts so hard, it's amazing he managed to have 2 children. Ecki trying to play with his brother's belt. A normal family, you would think. A normal family with, by now, a very abnormal father. I said to my own father before he died, "What was your dad like?" He said he was very strict, very distant. He said he would go to work in the morning, a chauffeur would collect him, take him to work, and then he would come back in the evening. And very often he'd be going on business trips for days at a time. And as soon as he got back, he'd go off again. And when he wasn't away, he'd spend time alone, gardening. And here is him gardening in his SS uniform. The family lived this bizarre life. This is my aunt and the maid on top of the bunker that was built by men that my dad said had dirty, striped uniforms. They would do all the jobs around the house, the plumbing, the electricity, the gas. Tailors. These were men from the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. My dad's brother ended his school life at the age of 16. He was taken out of school and made to fight, to man the guns against the Allied bombers. And that seems like a tough life. But bear in mind that at the exact same time this was happening, Noemie's grandparents were killed at Auschwitz. Young Dieter at 16 was sent away to train how to kill people. And he took the family camera, and it's clear from this picture that Dieter was the world's worst cameraman because he kept chopping off heads and feet. Heads and feet. But at 18, he left Berlin. His father sent him to die. He sent him to join the Panzers, the tank regiment, where the chances of survival were 5%, and Dieter went willingly. Here is Karl in the middle, grandfather Karl, in charge of everything. Dieter on the left. This was the last photograph the family had of Dieter at home. He was at home in Christmas 1944. And at the end of March, after he'd gone off to fight, my dad and his brother remembered their father coming home and saying to them, "We're being relocated to the Alps." Of course, the Russians were coming. They went down the length of Germany as Germany was approaching a state of collapse. And they stopped off somewhere on the way. They stopped off here at Dachau. My wife and I followed the same route that the family took. We arrived at Dachau at the same time as they did. But before we set off, I told my dad what we were doing. And he told me a story. And I'm sorry, but this is rather chilling. He said that the family for 2 or 3 nights were located in an SS barracks hut. He remembered that it overlooked a low building with a tall chimney. He could remember he was sitting on a bunk bed. His parents were standing at the window. His mother said, "You know what they're doing in there?" His father said, "No." She said, "Well, they're killing them. They're killing the Jews and burning the bodies." His father said, "No, they wouldn't do that." She said, "Of course they would. Can't you smell the flesh?" I went to see the archivists at Dachau. By now I knew who my grandfather was. His businesses were concentration camps. His workers were slave laborers, people who were being worked to death. And I asked the archivists, is it just possible that my grandfather could have gone to Auschwitz, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and not realized from the skeletal bodies, the beatings, the murders? Could he not realize what was going on? And they said, that is impossible. I came out of the archive. My wife took this photograph, and I had no recollection of her taking it. That's the hard bit done now. Now we move on, just as the family moved on. The family were fleeing to the Alps. They reached this valley as we did at the exact same time of the year. There was snow on the ground. They went to the top of the valley, and there they waited until one day an American jeep drove up the valley. 4 heavily armed men got out, beat up my grandfather, arrested him, and he was taken away. The rest of the family, what could they do? They went down to the nearest town, which was now occupied by the American army. And here is my dad wearing an American soldier's helmet, and his brother wearing a little cap that the Americans had made for him. We move on 5 years now. My aunt has come over from Scotland for the summer. Her father, my grandfather, has spent 3 years, just 3 years, in a kind of prison, an old prisoner of war camp. That was his justice, if that's what you call it. 2 boys at the back, my dad and his brother, and then the dead son at the back. This was the photograph that my grandmother had above her bed for the rest of her life. Take a look at the lapels. I sent this photograph to the Imperial War Museum. They said this is the uniform of an SS private, but the lapels are obscured. Yes, they were obscured. My grandmother had penciled out the SS flashes. The supreme irony was that my grandparents were buried opposite the Jewish cemetery. And the one thing that kept me going through researching and writing this story was a man called Bernhard Gelderblom, who told me that his father had committed atrocities in Poland. And while he could accept what his father had done, he said he could not accept his father saying, "I would do it again." And so Bernhard, when he retired as a history teacher, decided to dedicate the rest of his life to teaching the children of Hameln and the neighboring villages about the Jewish communities who had lived there before Hitler. Not only that, he got their parents to repair the gravestones that had been destroyed by the Nazis. He was an inspiration. But Noemie is another inspiration. The fact that we have come together, not just from different backgrounds, but from families who treated the Holocaust in very different ways. On the left, my own family, who hid through shame and resentment all that had happened and all that they had done. And then Noemie's family, her parents telling their stories, passing it on to Noemie so that this story will never disappear. I think at this point, I shall hand back to Noemie to say one last thing.
But if I may speak on Derek's behalf, for us, it would be most powerful to know that you have taken something away from both our stories and reflect and maybe change something in your lives to show that you care. And I'm sure we're all capable of that, just that. And it might be in the smallest of ways, just doing an act or defending somebody else, speaking up and out. It does take courage, that, but little steps towards that would be huge. Or even going into schools or telling young people, or come back to us and ask us. We're here for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.